This is based on a true life story, and what will happen in the end will shock you. The cabin doors of the luxurious aircraft closed with a soft thud as Helen and her 5-year-old daughter, Sophia, stepped into the brightly lit VIP section. The spacious cabin exuded an air of opulence, with its plush leather seats, sleek wooden panels, and the faint scent of fresh flowers wafting through the air. The two looked slightly out of place amid the polished crowd, dressed as they were in simple, clean clothes. Helen wore a well-fitted, navy blue dress that, while neat and modest, lacked the extravagance often expected in such a setting. Sophia, clutching a small stuffed bear in her tiny hands, was dressed in a pink frock that had clearly seen many washes, but was lovingly ironed for the trip. Mariah, a young and sharply dressed flight attendant, watched them enter. Her polished appearance, with her tailored uniform, pristine makeup, and tightly coiled bun, spoke of someone who valued image above all else. From her position near the aisle, she observed Helen and Sophia as they were escorted to their seats. Her lips curled ever so slightly into a smirk, betraying her immediate judgment. "Must be one of those giveaway winners," she muttered under her breath to a colleague standing nearby. Her tone was dripping with disdain, her eyes narrowing as she assessed Helen's unassuming demeanor and Sophia's childlike innocence. "What did you say?" her colleague, Charles, asked, leaning slightly closer. Charles was an older flight attendant with a kind face and a more composed manner. "Those two," Mariah said, tilting her head slightly toward Helen and Sophia. "They're probably here because of some promotional raffle or charity giveaway. You can tell just by looking at them. They don't belong in the VIP cabin." Charles glanced at Helen and Sophia, his brows furrowing. "You don't know that, Mariah. Besides, it's not our place to judge. Everyone here is a passenger deserving of equal respect." Mariah rolled her eyes, unimpressed by Charles's response. "You'll see," she said dismissively, crossing her arms and returning her attention to the other passengers. Helen, meanwhile, was oblivious to Mariah's judgmental gaze. She was more concerned with settling Sophia into her seat. The little girl squirmed with excitement, her big, curious eyes scanning the cabin. "Mummy, look," she exclaimed, pointing to the window beside her. "I can see the planes outside." "Yes, darling," Helen said gently, smoothing down Sophia's hair. "That's where they keep the other planes. We'll be flying soon." Sophia giggled, bouncing slightly in her seat. "I can't wait. Is it going to feel like a roller coaster?" Helen chuckled softly. "Not quite, my love. It's much smoother, but you'll like it." As they settled into their seats, a few other passengers in the VIP cabin cast fleeting glances at the mother and daughter. Most didn't linger. They were either engrossed in their own conversations or scrolling through their phones. However, Mariah's gaze remained fixed on them, her sharp eyes scrutinizing every detail: the scuffed soles of Helen's shoes, the slightly faded hem of Sophia's dress, and the way Helen carried herself with quiet confidence despite her modest appearance. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Mariah finally said as she approached their row, her smile professional but strained. "May I offer you and your daughter something to drink before we take off?" Helen looked up, her expression warm but reserved. "Water for both of us, please." Mariah nodded, her smile tightening. "Of course." She turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the galley. Under her breath, she muttered, "Water. Figures." When she returned, she placed 2 glasses of water on the tray table without much ceremony. Helen thanked her politely, but Mariah barely acknowledged it, her mind already jumping to conclusions about how someone like Helen could afford to be in the VIP section. Sophia, unaware of Mariah's cold demeanor, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said in her small, clear voice. "Do you know how fast the plane goes?" Mariah paused, taken aback by the question. For a moment, she considered brushing the child off but decided to respond, albeit curtly. "Very fast," she said. "About 500 miles per hour." "Wow." Sophia's face lit up. "That's faster than a car, right, Mummy?" Helen smiled at her daughter. "Much faster, sweetheart." Mariah sighed softly, her patience clearly thinning. "If you'll excuse me, I have other passengers to attend to, she said before walking away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Sophia watched her leave, her head tilting slightly. Mummy, is she angry? She asked innocently. No, darling, Helen said softly, patting Sophia's hand. She's just busy. From her station near the galley, Maria continued to observe Helen and Sophia out of the corner of her eye. She couldn't shake the sense of indignation she felt, as though their presence somehow diminished the exclusivity of the VIP cabin. People like that don't belong here, she muttered to herself. Charles, overhearing her, frowned. Maria, what's your problem? They're just passengers like anyone else. Maria shrugged. It's not a problem. I'm just saying there's a certain standard for this section, and they don't meet it. Charles shook his head. You don't know their story. Maybe they worked hard for this. Maybe they're here for a special reason. Either way, it's not our place to judge. Maria huffed but didn't respond. She wasn't interested in hearing excuses for what she saw as an obvious case of undeserving privilege. Her focus returned to the other passengers, all of whom, in her eyes, better fit the VIP mold. Meanwhile, Helen leaned back at her seat, quietly observing the other passengers and the cabin crew. She could feel Maria's lingering hostility, but chose not to dwell on it. She had long since learned to rise above judgment and negativity, especially when it came to Sophia's happiness. Her daughter's excitement and curiosity were all that mattered to her. Mummy, Sophia whispered, leaning closer. Do you think we'll see clouds up close? Helen smiled, her heart warming at her daughter's innocence. Yes, my love. We'll be flying right through them. Sophia giggled again, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. I can't wait. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Helen helped Sophia buckle her seatbelt, making sure she was comfortable. She glanced out the window, her expression calm but thoughtful. Despite the subtle hostility they had encountered, Helen was determined to make this journey a memorable one for her daughter. Maria, however, remained steadfast in her assumptions. As she moved through the cabin, tending to other passengers, she couldn't help but glance at Helen and Sophia again, her thoughts filled with judgment. To her, they were an anomaly, a reminder that not everyone in the VIP section fit the image of wealth and privilege she had come to expect. For Helen and Sophia, though, none of this mattered. Their journey had just begun, and they were determined to enjoy every moment of it, regardless of the whispers, stares, or assumptions that followed them. Now, this is the interesting part of the life story. The plane had been in the air for about 30 minutes. The engines hummed steadily, creating a soothing background noise in the luxurious VIP cabin. Sophia, seated comfortably next to her mother, held a glass of orange juice carefully with both hands. Her eyes were wide with excitement as she looked out the window at the blue sky and clouds. Mummy, look. The clouds look like big, fluffy cotton, Sophia said with a giggle, pointing eagerly out the window. Her enthusiasm made Helen smile. They do, don't they, my love? Maybe you can draw them when we get home, Helen replied, gently adjusting Sophia's seatbelt. Sophia nodded enthusiastically, taking a sip of her juice. But in her excitement, her small hands wobbled, and the glass tilted forward. Before Helen could react, the juice spilled onto the plush carpet beneath their seats. The bright orange liquid spread quickly, forming a small but noticeable stain. Oh no! Sophia gasped, looking down at the mess. Mummy, I spilled it. Helen immediately reached for a napkin, her face calm. It's okay, darling. Accidents happen. Let's clean it up, she said soothingly, dabbing at the juice with a napkin. Maria, who had been walking down the aisle, noticed the commotion. Her sharp eyes locked onto the stain on the carpet. With a sigh of exasperation, she marched over to their row, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. What is going on here? Maria demanded, her voice loud enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. Her hands were on her hips, and her expression was a mix of irritation and condescension. Sophia, startled by the harsh tone, shrank back in her seat. I spilled my juice, she said softly, her eyes filling with tears. Maria's expression hardened. Do you have any idea how expensive that carpet is? She snapped, glaring down at the little girl. This is the VIP cabin, not some playground. You need to be more careful. Helen looked up at Mariah, her face calm but firm. I understand your concern, but it was an accident. My daughter didn't mean to spill it, she said, her tone measured. Mariah, however, wasn't ready to back down. An accident? She repeated, her voice rising. This is exactly why children shouldn't be in the VIP section. They don't know how to behave. Sophia's lower lip quivered as she clutched her stuffed bear tightly. I'm sorry, she whispered, her small voice barely audible. Helen placed a comforting hand on Sophia's shoulder. There's no need to make a scene, she said to Mariah, her voice still calm but with an edge of authority. I've already started cleaning it up. Mariah let out a short, mocking laugh. Cleaning it up? Do you think a few napkins will fix this? This isn't some budget airline. She gestured dramatically at the carpet, as if the spill were a catastrophe. By now, several passengers had turned to watch the interaction. Some exchanged disapproving glances, while others whispered among themselves. A few looked at Mariah with raised eyebrows, clearly finding her reaction over the top. Charles, the senior flight attendant, approached the scene, sensing the tension. Is everything okay here? He asked, his tone neutral but curious. Mariah turned to him, her expression exasperated. No, it's not. This child spilled juice all over the carpet, and now look at the mess. Honestly, what were they thinking bringing a kid into the VIP cabin? Charles glanced at the stain and then at Sophia, who was now holding back tears. He looked at Helen, who met his gaze with quiet dignity. Mariah, it's just a little juice, Charles said calmly. I'll get a cleaning kit and take care of it. There's no need to make a big deal. No need to make a big deal? Mariah repeated, her voice sharp. This kind of behavior is unacceptable. If people want to sit in the VIP cabin, they should know how to act appropriately. Sophia couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She buried her face in Helen's side, her small shoulders shaking. Mummy, I'm sorry, she sobbed. I didn't mean to spill it. Helen wrapped her arms around Sophia, gently stroking her hair. It's okay, darling, she said softly. It was just an accident. Turning to Mariah, Helen's calm demeanor remained intact. I've apologized, and my daughter has apologized as well. I think that's enough. Mariah folded her arms, her face still set in a scowl. Maybe for you, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. But some of us have to deal with the consequences of your carelessness. Charles frowned, clearly unhappy with Mariah's tone. Mariah, that's enough, he said firmly. This isn't the way to handle the situation. Mariah opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when she noticed the disapproving looks from the other passengers. With a huff, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. Sophia lifted her tear-streaked face to look at Helen. Mummy, is she mad at me? She asked, her voice trembling. No, my love, Helen said gently, wiping away Sophia's tears. She's just having a bad day. It has nothing to do with you. Charles knelt beside them, offering a kind smile. Don't worry, little one, he said to Sophia. Accidents happen all the time. You didn't do anything wrong. Sophia sniffled and nodded, her grip on her stuffed bear relaxing slightly. Charles stood up and gave Helen a reassuring look. I'll take care of the stain, he said. And I'm sorry for Mariah's behavior. That was uncalled for. Thank you, Helen said, her voice warm. She appreciated his kindness, but knew the incident had left a mark on Sophia's confidence. As Charles left to fetch the cleaning kit, Helen turned her attention back to her daughter. Do you remember what we talked about, Sophia? She asked softly. About not letting other people's words hurt you? Sophia nodded slowly, her tears finally subsiding. Yes, Mummy. Good, Helen said, kissing her forehead. Because you're a wonderful, kind, and brave girl, and nothing anyone says can change that. Sophia managed a small smile, her spirits lifting slightly. She leaned against her mother, feeling safe in her embrace. Meanwhile, Mariah stood at the galley, her arms crossed and her face set in a scowl. She glanced over at Helen and Sophia, her mind still clouded with judgment. But the disapproving stares from some of the passengers made her shift uncomfortably. As the cabin settled back into its usual calm, Helen quietly continued to comfort Sophia, determined to make the rest of the flight as smooth as possible for her daughter. While the spill and Mariah's harsh words had left a temporary shadow over their journey, Helen's calm and nurturing presence reminded Sophia that kindness and patience were far stronger than anger or judgment. The flight continued smoothly after the earlier commotion, but Sophia couldn't shake off the guilt she felt about spilling her juice. She sat quietly in her seat, her stuffed bear clutched tightly in her lap, her usually bright and cheerful face now subdued. Beside her, Helen kept an arm around her daughter, sensing her unease. "Mummy," Sophia whispered, her voice soft. "Do you think that lady is still mad at me?" Helen looked down at her daughter, her heart aching at the sadness in her little girl's eyes. "I don't know, my love," she replied gently. "But you've already apologized, and that's all you can do. Sometimes people stay upset for reasons that have nothing to do with us." Sophia nodded, but her brow remained furrowed. "Maybe if I say sorry again, she'll feel better." Helen hesitated, unsure how to respond. She admired her daughter's kind heart, but worried about exposing her to more hostility. "Sophia, you don't have to." "I want to, Mummy," Sophia interrupted, her voice firm despite its smallness. "I don't want her to be upset because of me." Helen sighed, knowing her daughter's determination. "All right, darling," she said softly, brushing a stray curl from Sophia's face. "But remember, you've already done your part by apologizing. If she doesn't accept it, that's not your fault." Sophia nodded again, her resolve strengthening. Clutching her bear tightly, she slid off her seat and took a deep breath. Her small feet patted softly on the carpet as she approached the galley, where Mariah stood sorting items on a service cart. The flight attendant's sharp posture and curt movements didn't deter Sophia, whose innocent heart only saw an opportunity to make things right. Mariah didn't notice the little girl at first. She was busy muttering to herself, her irritation from earlier still bubbling under the surface. "Some people really don't belong in first class," she grumbled, stacking cups with unnecessary force. Sophia stopped a few feet away, hesitant for a moment. She clutched the hem of her pink dress nervously, then stepped closer. "Excuse me," she said timidly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mariah turned her head slightly, frowning. "What is it?" she asked brusquely, not bothering to hide her annoyance. Sophia took another step forward, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to tug on Mariah's sleeve. "I'm really sorry about the juice," she said, her big brown eyes looking up at the flight attendant with earnest sincerity. "I didn't mean to make a mess." For a moment, Mariah stared at the little girl in silence. The soft murmur of passengers in the cabin seemed to fade as the tension in the air grew palpable. Sophia's apology, so pure and genuine, was met with a look of irritation rather than understanding. Mariah's face hardened. "You think saying sorry fixes everything?" she snapped, her voice cold and sharp. "Do you know how much trouble you've caused? Do you have any idea how much that carpet costs?" Sophia's eyes widened, tears welling up as she shrank back. I just wanted to say sorry," she stammered, her voice quivering. Mariah's frustration boiled over. Without thinking, she raised her hand and slapped Sophia across the cheek. The sound of the slap echoed through the cabin like a clap of thunder, silencing every conversation and drawing the attention of every passenger. Sophia stumbled backward, her small hand flying to her reddening cheek. Her stuffed bear fell to the floor as tears streamed down her face. "Mummy," she cried, her voice breaking with pain and shock. Helen, who had been watching from her seat, was on her feet in an instant. Her heart pounded as she rushed to her daughter's side, kneeling to gather the trembling child into her arms. "Sophia," she said urgently, her voice filled with both concern and anger. "Are you all right, my love?" Sophia buried her face in Helen's shoulder, her sobs muffled but heart-wrenching. Helen stroked her daughter's back, whispering soothing words, but her eyes burned with fury as she turned her gaze to Mariah. The passengers in the VIP cabin were stunned. Some gasped audibly, while others whispered in disbelief. A man in a business suit leaned toward his companion, muttering, "Did she just slap that little girl?" Mariah, realizing the weight of her actions, straightened up but made no move to apologize. Instead, she crossed her arms defensively. "She shouldn't have tugged on my sleeve," she said, her tone unapologetic. "I was busy, and she shouldn't have disturbed me." Helen rose to her feet, still holding Sophia protectively. Her voice was low and measured, but there was no mistaking the anger simmering beneath her words. "How dare you," she said, her eyes locking onto Mariah's with unwavering intensity. "She's just a child. What gives you the right to put your hands on her?" Mariah opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Charles appeared, his face a mixture of shock and disapproval. "Mariah, what on earth are you doing?" he demanded, stepping between her and Helen. "You just hit a passenger, a child no less." Mariah's defensiveness only grew. She was being disruptive, she argued, gesturing towards Sophia, who clung tightly to Helen. "I was trying to teach her a lesson." "A lesson?" Charles repeated incredulously. "Do you even hear yourself?" There is absolutely no excuse for this behavior. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, some openly voicing their outrage. A woman seated near the front of the cabin shook her head in disbelief. "That poor child," she said to the man beside her. "This is unacceptable." Helen, still focused on comforting Sophia, looked at Charles. "I want this addressed immediately," she said firmly. "I won't let this go." Charles nodded, his expression grim. "I understand, ma'am, and I assure you, this will be dealt with." Mariah, now realizing that she had no support, shifted uncomfortably. "I was just doing my job," she muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your job is to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers," Charles snapped, his usually calm demeanor replaced by visible anger. "Not to assault a child. You've crossed a line, Mariah." As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, Helen carried Sophia back to their seats, her movements gentle despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She sat down, cradling her daughter and whispering reassurances. "You're safe now, my love," she said softly. "I'm here." Sophia nodded weakly, her small hands clutching Helen's dress as her sobs began to subside. The reddened mark on her cheek was a painful reminder of the ordeal, but Helen's comforting presence began to soothe her. Meanwhile, Charles turned to address the cabin, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for what you've witnessed. Please rest assured that this incident will be handled appropriately." The passengers slowly returned to their seats, though the tension in the air remained thick. Mariah stood off to the side, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. The judgmental stares from some of the passengers finally seemed to penetrate her defenses, and she shifted uncomfortably. As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere in the VIP cabin was forever changed. Sophia's innocent attempt to make amends had ended in an act of cruelty, leaving a mark not just on her cheek, but on the hearts of everyone who witnessed. Sophia's loud sobs echoed through the cabin, shattering the stunned silence that had fallen after the slap. She clutched her small hand to her reddened cheek, her tiny body trembling with shock and pain. Helen, who had rushed to her side the moment the slap landed, knelt in front of her daughter and enveloped her in a protective embrace. "It's okay, my love. Mummy's here," Helen murmured softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. She gently stroked Sophia's back, rocking her slightly to calm her down. "You're safe now. You're safe." Passengers whispered among themselves, their murmurs filled with disbelief and outrage. A woman in a crisp business suit leaned over to her companion, her voice sharp. "Did you see that? She hit a child. What kind of person does that?" Another man shook his head, his eyes narrowing at Mariah, who stood stiffly near the galley. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. "Completely unacceptable." Helen, however, paid no attention to the murmurs or the accusing stares directed at Mariah. Her focus was entirely on Sophia, whose sobs were slowly subsiding under her mother's soothing words. "Show, my darling," Helen whispered, wiping the tears from Sophia's cheeks with the sleeve of her dress. "I know it hurts, but you're so brave. Mummy's here, and everything will be all right." Sophia sniffled, her small hands gripping Helen's arms tightly. "Mummy, why did she hit me?" she asked through her tears, her voice trembling with confusion and hurt. Helen's heart ached at the question, but she kept her tone calm and gentle. "Sometimes people do things that are wrong because they're upset or unhappy, my love," she explained, cupping Sophia's tear-streaked face. "But it's never your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." Sophia nodded slowly, her breathing starting to even out. Helen kissed her forehead, holding her close as she continued to shield her from the chaos around them. Mariah, meanwhile, stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of defensiveness and irritation. "I was just doing my job," she muttered, loud enough for a few passengers to hear. "That child shouldn't have been bothering me. Parents these days need to teach their kids some manners." Her dismissive words only fueled the growing outrage among the passengers. A woman sitting a few rows away turned to glare at Mariah. "Doing your job?" she said incredulously. "Your job is to serve and ensure the comfort of passengers, not assault them." Charles, the senior flight attendant, stepped forward, his face stern. "Mariah, enough," he said firmly. "You're making things worse." Mariah huffed but said nothing, her posture stiff as she avoided looking at Helen and Sophia. Helen, still cradling her daughter, took a deep breath and looked up at Charles. Her expression was calm, though her eyes betrayed a hint of the pain and anger she was holding back. "Thank you for stepping in earlier," she said softly. "But I hope this is addressed properly. No one should have to go through this, especially a child." Charles nodded, his voice apologetic. "I assure you, ma'am, this is not something we take lightly. I'm truly sorry for what happened." Helen offered a small nod of acknowledgement, but said nothing further. She didn't want to escalate the situation or cause a scene, even though her heart was heavy with anger and hurt. Instead, she focused on calming Sophia, who was now snuggled against her, her little hands clutching Helen's dress. As the murmurs in the cabin grew louder, a man in a tailored suit stood up and addressed Helen directly. "Ma'am, I just want to say that your composure in this situation is remarkable," he said. "Many people would have reacted very differently, but you've handled this with such grace." Helen looked at him and gave a faint smile. "Thank you," she replied simply. "My priority is my daughter." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, nodded in agreement. "You're an incredible mother," she said. "The way you've comforted her is truly inspiring." Despite the kind words, Helen's focus remained on Sophia. "Are you feeling a little better now, my love?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from Sophia's face. Sophia nodded slowly, though her eyes were still red and puffy. "A little bit, Mummy," she said, her voice small. Helen kissed her forehead again. "That's my brave girl," she said softly. Charles cleared his throat and addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I deeply apologize for the incident that occurred," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Please rest assured that this matter will be handled appropriately. In the meantime, we ask for your patience and understanding." Most of the passengers nodded, though the tension in the air remained thick. Mariah stood off to the side, her arms still crossed and her expression sour. She avoided making eye contact with anyone, clearly aware of the judgmental stares directed her way. Helen, meanwhile, continued to radiate a quiet strength. Despite the humiliation and pain she felt, she refused to let it show. Her calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Mariah's defensive attitude, earning her the silent admiration of those around her. A young woman seated across the aisle leaned over and spoke to Helen. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask," she said softly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." Helen offered her a polite smile.
"Thank you," she said.
"I appreciate your kindness." As the plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin slowly began to dissipate. Passengers returned to their conversations and activities, though the occasional glance in Mariah's direction made it clear that the incident wasn't forgotten. Helen, still holding Sophia close, looked out the window at the clouds. She took a deep breath, allowing the steady hum of the engines to calm her own nerves. She knew this was an experience neither she nor Sophia would forget, but she was determined to turn it into a lesson for her daughter. "Remember, my love," she said softly, stroking Sophia's hair. "No matter what happens, we must always choose kindness and strength. That's what makes us truly strong." Sophia looked up at her mother, her tear-streaked face softening into a small smile. "Okay, Mummy," she said, her voice filled with trust. Helen kissed her forehead once more, holding her close as the plane continued its journey through the sky. The VIP cabin buzzed with tension. Passengers exchanged disapproving glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just transpired. Mariah stood stiffly near the galley, her arms crossed, her expression one of defensive defiance. Despite the whispers of outrage and the visible distress of Helen and Sophia, she appeared unbothered, even indignant. Charles, the senior flight attendant, had been observing the entire incident. He had tried to remain composed, hoping Mariah would realize the gravity of her actions and apologize. But her dismissive attitude and the shocking slap she had delivered to a child made it clear that intervention was not just necessary, it was overdue. Taking a deep breath, Charles stepped forward, his usually kind face now set in firm resolve. His steps were deliberate, drawing the attention of every passenger as the murmurs slowly died down. All eyes were on him as he stopped in front of Mariah. "Mariah," Charles said, his voice calm but commanding, "we need to talk. Right now." Mariah turned toward him, her posture defensive. "What is it, Charles?" she snapped. "I've already handled the situation." Charles's brow furrowed. "Handle the situation?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Mariah, what you did was not handling anything. You physically struck a child, a passenger on this flight. Do you even understand how serious that is?" Mariah rolled her eyes, her arms tightening across her chest. "The kid was misbehaving," she said, her tone dismissive. "She tugged on my sleeve and disrupted my work. Someone needed to teach her some manners." Charles's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, his voice firm but controlled. "Mariah, your job is to ensure the safety and comfort of every passenger on this flight, regardless of their age or behavior. You're not here to teach lessons, and you're certainly not here to lay hands on anyone. What you did was completely unacceptable." The passengers watched intently, their expressions a mix of shock and approval as Charles confronted Mariah. A middle-aged man seated in the front row leaned over to the woman next to him and whispered, "Finally, someone's putting her in her place." Mariah, however, was far from remorseful. She straightened her posture, her expression hardening further. "The child needed to learn not to interfere with people who are working," she argued. "If her mother had been paying attention, this wouldn't have happened." At this, a wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. One passenger, a woman with glasses and a kind demeanor, couldn't stay silent any longer. "Are you seriously blaming a 5-year-old for your behavior?" she said, her voice sharp. "What kind of professional acts this way?" Charles raised a hand to calm the growing tension among the passengers. "Enough, everyone," he said, his voice authoritative. He turned back to Mariah, his expression one of barely restrained disappointment. "Mariah, this isn't about the child or her mother. This is about you and your behavior. You acted in a way that is not only unprofessional but also completely unacceptable by any standard." Mariah opened her mouth to respond, but Charles cut her off, his voice growing sterner. "There are no excuses for what you did."
None.
"You assaulted a passenger, a child, no less, and your refusal to acknowledge your mistake only makes this worse." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers nodded in agreement. Helen, still seated with Sophia cradled in her arms, watched quietly, her calm demeanor unshaken. Though she didn't speak, her eyes conveyed both gratitude for Charles's intervention and quiet strength in the face of the ordeal. Mariah's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I was under a lot of stress," she said defensively. "You don't understand how hard this job can be." Charles's expression hardened. "Mariah, I've been doing this job for over a decade," he said firmly. I understand the stresses better than anyone. But no amount of stress justifies violence. You crossed a line that should never be crossed. One of the passengers, a young man wearing headphones around his neck, chimed in from his seat. You can't just slap someone and blame it on stress, he said. That's ridiculous. Another passenger, an older woman near the window, nodded in agreement. This is a child we're talking about, she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. She didn't deserve this. Mariah looked around, realizing the weight of the disapproval directed at her. Her defiance faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her tone still defensive. I didn't mean to hit her that hard, she muttered, as if that made her actions any less severe. Charles shook his head, his disappointment evident. Mariah, whether you meant to or not doesn't matter. The fact is, you did. And now you need to take responsibility for your actions. Mariah said nothing, her jaw tightening as she avoided Charles's gaze. The tension in the air was almost tangible as the cabin fell silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Charles took a step back, his voice steady but firm as he addressed Mariah one last time. Your behavior today will have serious consequences, he said. I'll be filing a report as soon as we land, and I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to explain yourself to management. Mariah's face paled slightly, though she said nothing. She turned away, retreating toward the galley without another word. Her stiff posture betrayed her discomfort, but she refused to show any outward signs of remorse. Charles turned to the passengers, his expression apologetic. Ladies and gentlemen, I deeply regret what has happened today, he said. Please know that this matter will be addressed appropriately, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. The passengers nodded, some offering quiet words of support for Charles's handling of the situation. A man in a tailored suit spoke up, his tone approving. Thank you for stepping in. That was the right thing to do. Charles nodded gratefully before turning to Helen and Sophia. His expression softened as he approached them, kneeling slightly to address them at eye level. Ma'am, I'm so sorry for what you and your daughter have experienced, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Please know that this is not representative of how we treat our passengers. I'll do everything in my power to ensure this doesn't go unaddressed. Helen looked at him, her expression calm but resolute. Thank you, Charles, she said quietly. I appreciate your support. Sophia, still holding on to her mother tightly, looked up at Charles with wide, tearful eyes. Are we in trouble? She asked softly, her voice trembling. Charles's heart ached at the question. He shook his head gently, offering her a reassuring smile. No, sweetheart, he said. You didn't do anything wrong. You're very brave, and I'm so sorry this happened to you. Sophia nodded slowly, her grip on Helen's dress relaxing slightly. Helen kissed her forehead, her calm strength continuing to comfort her daughter. As Charles rose to his feet, the cabin began to settle once more. The tension lingered, but there was a sense of relief among the passengers that someone had finally stepped in to address the situation. Helen and Sophia remained the quiet center of attention, their unshaken composure leaving a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed their ordeal.